Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon as it is now. It's my great pleasure to speak with you this afternoon, and I'd also begin by acknowledging that this wonderful institution of learning is on Durrumbal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. This paper is a bit theory heavy, but at its heart, it is about history. When we discuss things like treaty, the voice, Makarata, recognition, even though these are ideas about the present and indeed the future, they are shaped by the past. I presented a version of this paper at the Australian Historical Association conference in July, and that was wonderful. At that conference, there was a unanimous motion passed by members of the association for the AHA to officially support the Uluru Statement. And it was very emotional, especially hearing from some of the advocates, and people were crying at points. And it was one of the more powerful conferences I've ever been to. But I don't think any of us are under the illusion that support and goodwill within academia is necessarily echoed outside. And indeed, there is also fierce resistance to the voice, often from the same people who historically were opposed to ATSIC and other First Nations bodies. And generally for the same types of reasons, this opposition comes up, and it's because they reject separateness. They don't want one parliament for one group of people and another parliament or another body for another group. But the problem with this idea of wanting to avoid separateness, as Dom Kelly has written, is that separateness can often be a euphemism for neo-assimilation. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is outline a political theory that actually comes from Israel, but I think it has some relevance to Australia as we negotiate this not only legal but also existential change to the Australian state being proposed. And I can't emphasise enough that I'm not claiming to have the answers on how to move forward, or even necessarily if this theory is a way forward. But I think it at least correctly identifies what the problem is and what the source of resistance to the Uluru Statement is. And that is recognising not only individual rights, but also collective rights within a state and what that might look like. And perhaps beyond that, there might be some value to be gleaned. I'm in the process of working this into a journal article, so any advice or comments would be gratefully received. In particular, I'd love to be directed to any relevant papers or books by First Nations scholars. Following the Coalition's election victory in May 2019, Noongar man Ken Wyatt was sworn in as the first Indigenous person to hold the Indigenous Australians portfolio, and he's seen there with Prime Minister Scott Morrison. On 10 July, he addressed the National Press Club to announce a possible referendum within 3 years on Indigenous recognition. Despite initial cautious optimism from supporters of the Uluru Statement, it soon became clear that a Morrison government would not endorse the first vital element, a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. While an essential poll found 66% of Australians do support the voice, a number of coalition MPs immediately stated their opposition. Like his Conservative predecessor, Malcolm Turnbull, Morrison understands the voice to be a third chamber that would disrupt Australia's bicameral system. Peter Dutton, who along with Morrison challenged for the Liberal leadership in 2018, also ruled it out for this reason. Wyatt was asked about the contested claim made by his colleagues that the voice would be a third chamber, and he responded diplomatically, quote, "I could understand some individuals would develop that perception, but insisted that's not the reality when you read it." On the possibility of a constitutionally enshrined voice, as outlined in the Uluru Statement, he was non-committal, despite wanting to see First Nations recognised on the birth certificate of the country, as he described it. he noted that an advisory body was more likely to be achieved through legislation. At a doorstop interview in Brisbane on 13 July, Morrison made his position explicit. He was asked, "Are you in Ken Wyatt's corner?" The Prime Minister responded, "Ken and I are of one mind on this. Issues of the process of a voice were not being considered in the constitutional context." So the first recommendation of the Uluru Statement is not going to be considered by the current government, let alone put to a referendum. The Uluru Statement from the Heart itself was released on 26 May 2017. The image on the screen there is Torres Strait Islander Thomas Mair, who is a powerful advocate. He's published a book on the journey to promote this statement, and he was one of the people who spoke at the AHA in a powerful plenary session. The statement is the endorsed statement of the First Nations National Constitutional Convention, which was a historic gathering of more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. The collective will of such a diverse and representative body carries enormous moral authority. The principal requests are a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, a treaty or series of treaties between the Commonwealth and First Nations, and a truth-telling commission. And the statement also invokes the Yolngu word makarata, and it says, Makarata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair, truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. The recommendations in the statement are remarkable in some ways for their mildness. There's no call for a parliamentary veto. Self-determination and the right to be heard as a collective is at the core. And the statement was further endorsed when the theme for NAIDOC Week this year was revealed as Voice, Treaty, Truth. The official website noted that these reforms represent the unified position of First Nations Australians. It's not just the reforms, but as law professor Megan Davis notes, the sequence is deliberate and significant. So the voice is the first vital step. So before moving on to this theory of egalitarian nationhoods, we need to take some time to consider what a nation is. And this may seem off topic or a detour, but it is important to state unequivocally that First Nations are legitimate nations. This isn't just a new term that has become popular or a synonym for Indigenous or Aboriginal. First Nations is replete with meaning. The words nation and state are different, but they are conflated so often that it's hard to imagine one without the other. Nation refers to a shared identity and culture, often shared ethnicity and history, whereas state is a political organisation, a government that controls a certain region and is recognised by other governments in a system of governments and a system of states. These are usually combined as nation-states to the point where they can seem like synonyms, but they're not. So Kurdistan, for example, is a nation, but not a state. The Kurdish people, who sadly are in the news at the moment, are a nation. And there are many other examples, but the most obvious and relevant one is the First Nations of this continent. Nevertheless, nationhood is often considered a modern construct, a quote-unquote real nation. It's often thought must have set territory and a community governed by common laws, and it also must be part of an international system of nation states legitimised by nationalist ideology. But one of the sort of leading theorists on nationalism who really challenges this idea is Anthony Smith, and he says this is a decidedly modernist notion and modernist way of viewing nationhood, and it's historically problematic. And medieval historians, for instance, would say there certainly was some idea of English and Englishness and French and the French nation and the German nation well before Westphalian diplomacy in the 17th century. So Smith tries to find what a nation really is and when a nation really is by instead employing what he calls ethno-symbolic approach. And he stresses the collective cultural identities over la longue durée. Viewed within this paradigm, the legitimacy of Australia's First Nations, the collective identities that have been forged over millennia, is beyond question. Rather, it's the legitimacy of the Australian nation that seems rather shaky and searching for legitimacy. Understanding First Nations to be legitimate nations is also a step towards decolonisation. The 19th century political theorist Lord Durham insisted that dual nationhood was incompatible with British colonisation, and he was the Governor-General of Canada in the 19th century, and he wrote a famous report called the Durham Report, popularly, and he wrote, "I found two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. I found a struggle not of principles, but of races." And he says this is a situation that just can't keep going. So what he was talking about was the French Canadians and the English Canadians, and saying that just doesn't work for a nation. So he proposed a very aggressive form of assimilation that would essentially force French Canadians to be absorbed into a hegemonic Britishness, something that French Canadians resisted very strongly. Over a century later, against a backdrop of international decolonisation and following a political victory for the Parti Québécois in the 1976 provincial election, French Canadians started to insist on their right to be viewed as a nation within the state. So the French nation within the Canadian state. And this sparked Canada's Indigenous people to say, well, hang on a minute, we've been here a lot longer than you, and they saw that as an opportunity to get constitutional recognition, and the term First Nations started being popularised in North America sort of around this time. The First Nations Constitutional Conference was held in Ottawa back in 1980. And 2 years later, the peak representative group of they were called the National Indian Brotherhood, and they renamed as the Assembly of First Nations. And Tom Flanagan has commented on this. The new term First Nations, with all its implicit assumptions about sovereignty and nationhood, rapidly became standard usage in Canada, and it was an invaluable asset that helped them achieve later political victories. So it's no accident that the authors of the Uluru Statement used the term the First Nations National Constitutional Convention. It's part of a global push to elevate Indigenous people to a position of equality with the colonial empires that dispossessed them. The uneasiness of some Australians in recognising the legitimacy of First Nations is revealed in debates over Australia Day. The modern Australian state came into being on 1 January 1901. Despite this, a pretty elementary fact of Australian history, I might add, there has been a concerted effort to push the origin story back to the 18th century, with James Cook anachronistically cast as some sort of father of the nation. And Scott Morrison, coincidentally the federal member for the seat of Cook, has dedicated $50 million to celebrate the 250th anniversary of his arrival on Australia's east coast next year. And the funds will be used for new memorials, an education centre, and even a replica ship to circumnavigate Australia, something that Cook himself did not do. The backdrop of this announcement was a public discussion about public memory and existing Cook statues, and this was in part sparked by journalist Stan Grant, who questioned the inscription "Discovered this territory 1770." which is on the base of the Cook statue in Sydney's Hyde Park. The Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, used pretty wild language describing any move to change the statue as Stalinist. He took to Facebook to call it, say, that's what Stalin did, referring to changing statues, as if there's no difference in context there. Not only was removing or editing the existing Cook statues ruled out by his government, with Morrison being the Treasurer at the time, the government went further by promising to build more monuments. And as Prime Minister, Morrison defended the move to use public money to cast Cook in a favourable light, noting that, quote, he gets a bit of a bad show from some of those who like to talk our history down. The Cook celebrations can be seen as part of the ongoing history wars and an effort to reclaim Australia's colonial history as something worthy of celebration. And every Australia Day, an increasingly large number of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people reject the narrative that Australia's colonial past must be celebrated. For traditional nationalists, however, 26 January 1788 is the beginning of the Australian story and therefore must be viewed positively despite what pain it has caused. Morrison articulated this view last year in September in response to Byron Bay Council's decision to move its citizenship ceremony to 25 January. As with other councils who had made this move previously, Byron Bay was stripped of its right to hold citizenship ceremonies. Taking to Twitter, the Prime Minister claimed it was an exercise in indulgent self-loathing, adding that, quote, our modern Australian nation began on January 26. Historians, myself included, were quick to respond to such an ahistorical claim. 1788 predates the states, the Parliament, the flag, the Constitution, and indeed the word Australian. Unlike ancient Australia, which has existed since time immemorial, or colonial Australia with incremental starting points, modern Australia does have a fixed and obvious beginning with federation. Despite this, a few years later, the Prime Minister claimed without irony, quote, you don't pretend your birthday was on a different day. Indifferent to the fact he was pretending the national birthday was on a different day, he returned to a teleological narrative that imagines the federated nation of Australia to be the inevitable, predetermined, perhaps even for a religious man like Morrison, divinely mandated outcome of British colonisation. To this end, the colonisation process must ultimately be viewed as good and worthy of celebration if the resulting nation is to be viewed in this way. As for Indigenous dispossession, massacres, the introduction of disease, destruction of culture, loss of language, and genocide, the Prime Minister echoed the euphemisms of his Liberal Party predecessor, John Howard, by referencing there was, quote, a few scars, some mistakes, some things we could have done better. So how we conceptualise colonial history and how we imagine First Nations to either fit inside or outside the grand narrative of Australianness is neither fixed nor predetermined. In his final Reith lecture in 2003, V.S. Ramachandran asked his audience to remember that politics, colonialism, imperialism, and war all originate in the human brain. The nation is a construct, or to use Benedict Anderson's well-known phrase, something that is largely imagined. Nevertheless, these imaginations gain legitimacy over time, especially as collective memories form and collective rights are asserted. Harry Hobbs has argued convincingly that Australian citizenship currently denies Indigenous peoplehood, and a meaningful legal reform must view First Nations as co-sovereigns on and of this land. If First Nations are to be afforded not special treatment, but equality as ethno-cultural communities, the right to self-determination must be constitutionally recognised. The Uluru Statement does not challenge the legitimacy of Australian nationhood, but asks for Indigenous nationhoods to be placed on an even footing. This, I put to you, is equality, not privilege. So with my remaining time this afternoon, I'd like to discuss a thought experiment based on the work of Israeli scholar Chaim Gans. In A Political Theory for the Jewish People, Gans introduces a notion of egalitarian Zionism. And he argues that egalitarian Zionism exists in the space between the dominant conservative ideology of proprietary Zionism, which essentially means Israel has a historical and legal right to exist as an exclusively Jewish state, and a minority left position of post-Zionism, which rejects the legitimacy of placing Jewishness at the center of national life. So Gans tries to find a middle ground, and he calls it egalitarian Zionism, and it provides a framework to accommodate Jews and Arabs where both can live together with their groups under conditions of equality with members of other ethnocultural groups. Applied to an Australian context, we get the idea of egalitarian nationhoods, a theory that rejects the triumphalism of the traditional colonial narrative, but also allows civic space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians to identify and celebrate their cultures. There are many obvious differences between the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Federation of the Australian States in 1901. There are a number of prominent arguments used to justify the special claim of the Jewish people, not only to the territorial, but also to cultural hegemony within the borders of Israel. These include a proprietary argument built on the claim that Israel is the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, an appeal to history, which highlights the legacy of persecution faced by the Jewish diaspora, and also a hierarchical argument which asserts the rights of ethnocultural collectives to self-determination. In Australia, by contrast, the British, who arrived to claim the continent in 1770 and then occupied in 1788, had no special claim to this land. Instead of asserting any historical connection with the land, the British denied that First Nations had one. As the continent was considered vacant, the British were free to claim proprietary rights on the basis of discovery or improvement. Today, with discovery so obviously a false claim, despite what Cook's statue may say, those who maintain the proprietary argument must cling all the more tenaciously to this idea of legitimation through improvement. Despite these differences, there are a number of similarities in the political framework that justifies both nations. In both cases, a proprietary right is claimed by the numerically and politically powerful collective at the expense of a minority. Early Zionists needed to justify Jewish national existence in Israel before the Jewish people were considered and recognized a nation. Similarly, European claims over the traditional lands of Australia's Indigenous peoples predate Australian nationhood. As such, the Australian nation needed a foundation myth, a colonial narrative to justify occupation. In Israeli political discourse, the proprietary historical argument essentially asserts that the land of Israel has been the Jewish homeland since ancient times. The Jewish people never conceded their proprietary rights, even though they were forcibly removed, and every generation has maintained a desire to return. In Australia, the British claimed proprietary rights under the legal fiction of terra nullius. After this was dismissed by the High Court, it became a crucial objective of the political right to popularise a narrative that minimises the damage and destruction of colonialism, because this is the premise on which the Australian nation is justified, in their view. As recently as 2014, an Australian Prime Minister defended colonisation by calling the arrival of the British the defining moment in Australian history, and justifying the resulting nation by claiming the continent was, quote, barely settled before. As in Israel, a nationhood property symbiosis has developed in Australia, where the justification for nationhood is tied to the legitimacy of the proprietary argument. As such, there is a particular urgency for some to downplay the negative impact of colonisation. And I don't have time to delve into the history wars, but if you're unfamiliar with that volatile period, I recommend Stuart McIntyre and Anna Clark's book of the same name. I will perhaps just say quickly that the views of John Howard and Paul Keating do somewhat exemplify not only the two sides of the history wars, but also the general tenets of proprietary historical nationalism versus egalitarian nationhood. For Keating, it was no assault on Australian identity to deliver the Redfern Address, nor was it for Kevin Rudd to deliver the National Apology in 2008. For John Howard, though, the apology represented an existential crisis where the validity of the Australian project itself would be forfeited. Drawing on Isaiah Berlin, Gans notes the importance of collectivist moral ontology. In this framework, the nation or the collective is a living organism and each individual is merely a cell. The implication being that if you allow individual rights to someone while denying their collective rights to be part of their ethnocultural group, then you're cutting them off from what it really means to be human or to be fully human. In Israel, the political establishment withholds collective rights from the Arab population. While equal rights can be granted as individuals, proprietary Zionism is invested in denying rights as a collective. In Australia also, there's a clear attempt on the part of the conservative political establishment to trumpet the equality that Indigenous Australians have as individuals, a narrative that goes all the way back to the early 19th century with Governor Arthur's famous poster that you can see there showing a type of equality that justice can be meted out on an individual level. But this allowance of individual rights, which only legally became equal rights in 1967, exists while denying the right to be seen as a collective and as a political entity, much less a nation, or many nations. The Keating Labor government imagined the 1990s were to be the decade of reconciliation and established the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation with the goal that this could be achieved by 2001. When the final report was released in 2000, it called for a move towards a treaty or set of treaties that would necessarily involve acknowledging not only Indigenous individual rights, but collective rights also. John Howard absolutely dismissed this and refused any kind of treaty, claiming that, quote, "a nation does not make a treaty with itself." In other words, only one collective can exist within the Australian state. Gans looks to egalitarian Zionism that can be justified in the face of a post-Zionist critique. So in Australia, perhaps what we need is an egalitarian nationhoods that can be justified in the face of a post-colonial critique. Gans offers two paths forward for the state of Israel. The first is for Jews and Palestinians to exist within the one state, but with autonomy equal to that of the other. And the second path is for the creation of two states. In the Israeli context, Gans proposes the second path is more practical, as broadly speaking, Jews and Palestinians prefer to live in a community where their culture is hegemonic and their people are numerically superior. In Australia, it is less obvious which path of egalitarian nationhoods would work best. At the moment, the conservative wing of Australian politics will contemplate neither. For Indigenous Australians to be viewed as a collective is to, or series of collectives, that is, series of nations, is to undermine the proprietary claim to the whole of the Australian territories. So the first step towards an egalitarian nationhoods in Australia would simply be to listen to Indigenous voices. At the AHA, there was a powerful explanation of how the Uluru Statement came about and why it is worth fighting for, led by Tila Reid, Tom Mayer and Eddie Sinnott, among others. Professor John Maynard was there as well and spoke powerfully. The requests in the statement are remarkable, as I said at the start, in some ways for their mildness. Under an egalitarian nationhood framework, it would not be unreasonable for First Nations to demand a single or multiplicity of separate states. Rather, it would be unreasonable to refuse such a request that ultimately asks for nothing more than what most non-Indigenous Australians claim for themselves: the right to live in their ethnocultural community and to pursue self-determination. But the Uluru Statement does not suggest anything so radical. It asks for recognition, respect, and the right to be consulted. Despite the restrained nature of the statement, it was rejected out of hand by the ruling Conservatives. Then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull claimed falsely that the body would become a third chamber of parliament. And as I stated at the beginning, several high Liberals, including the Prime Minister, have since repeated that claim. And essentially, the right of Aboriginal Australians to be seen as a collective is in conflict with the desire of some Australians to see them only as equal individuals under a hegemonic Australianness. An egalitarian nationhoods theory, as articulated by Gans, respects the right of First Nation peoples to be acknowledged as a collective and to seek self-determination. In Australia, this is certainly possible within a single state, and possibly that's the most desirable solution. It does involve, however, a willingness by the Australian government to respect and consult Indigenous communities on matters that concern them, especially in areas where they constitute a numeric majority. That said, a two or more state solution for Australia should not be off the table should Indigenous Australians request such an arrangement. A change to the Constitution, though, of course, can't be passed by the government. It must be put in a referendum to the people, where the vast majority of voters will be non-Indigenous. So, to state it plainly, the 97% must be willing to stand with the 3% for this to happen. The result will be an important litmus test for Australia's willingness to deal with its difficult heritage, as Shannon MacDonald would phrase it, with honesty and maturity. The adoption of the Uluru Statement would be not only a legal step towards justice for First Nations, but also a philosophic step from proprietary nationalism to egalitarian nationhoods, and ultimately a release from the patriotic obligation felt by some to defend a colonial narrative inescapably linked to suffering and devastation for First Nations. Thank you.